It's that time of year where I read you some scary stories in the dark. Well, I'm not always in the dark, but today I will be. So I want you to come closer. Come close, I won't bite too hard. I have 4 scary stories to read to you tonight, and they won't be too scary, I promise. I very carefully look through collections of short stories to find ones that might give you the heebie-jeebies, but they shouldn't keep you up all night. Because I would love if you could still fall asleep to this video. So put on headphones if you want to hear my voice moving around like this, or not, if it's easier for you to fall asleep that way. You can follow the timestamps on the bottom of the video to jump to a certain story, and I will put links to where I found them on Reddit in the description. Alright. Without further ado, let's get started. This first story is called I Discovered Something Frightening About My Son at a PTA meeting. I just started remembering what it was like being 9 years old, the same age my son Wyatt is now. He's my only kid, and he's a gentle and curious boy, which is why I worry this whole thing is about to go horribly wrong. I was tough, but I think my parents' divorce was what set it off for me. I didn't see it coming and wasn't prepared for being alone in our big house with just my mom. But Dad had to leave, so it was just us. Everything felt different after he left, especially my room. It always felt like there were sets of eyes following me from under the bed to the closet and then back again. I'd walk past the closet and see movement in my peripherals, but I never turned fast enough to catch it. The incidents in the closet grew over time. It'd be every 3 or 4 nights, sometimes 6, sometimes 10, just long enough for me to hope the thing wasn't coming back. But then I'd be laying in bed and a coat hanger would twist and squeak, or a toy block would tumble, or pages in a book would flip. One night, the closet door slowly creaked open. I pulled the covers down and finally saw what it was. My scream shook the town, and my mom was in my room in under 5 seconds flat. She'd been awake and trying to drink herself to sleep down the hall. My mom checked the closet, but found nothing. I convinced her to let me sleep in her bed that night, but she was adamant it wouldn't become a habit. I knew I couldn't stay in my room anymore, and didn't really want to stay in the house, but I didn't like the idea of that thing in my room or near my mom. So the next night, I made a plan and spent the whole day preparing. It was shortly after midnight when my closet door creaked open. A tall, impossibly long-limbed figure ducked out from under the frame of the closet and into my room. moved awkwardly like a man unable to fully control his limbs. His body and head were tiny, reminding me of daddy long-legged spiders. The man had to curl under the ceiling as he approached my bed. He leaned over the tiny mound under the blankets and peeled them back to reveal clothes strategically placed to resemble my body, and in the center, a knife pointed upwards, taped to a mechanical toy trebuchet. Its trigger pin had a long string attached to it, which ran off the bed and behind the dresser along the wall, and to a mound of clothes in the corner, which I was hidden in. I tricked it. I pulled the string, and the pin yanked out. The trebuchet snapped forward, and a knife swung up, slamming into the tall man's face. He stumbled backwards, falling into the closet and pulling the door shut behind him. I climbed out of my hunting blind with a hockey stick I taped a flashlight to, and another one of my mom's knives to the end of. I opened the closet, ready to jump forward, but it was empty. I turned on the ceiling lights and found a trail of strange, dark blood from my bed to the middle of the closet. Then blood disappeared in the middle of the floor. I cleaned the blood up with bleach and left the light on for the rest of the night. Then I moved to the second part of my plan. Our family were big campers, and I'd watched my dad set up the tent plenty of times. I loved sleeping outside under the stars, and convinced my mom to let me sleep in the backyard in the tent for the week. The week turned into a month, and that turned into 3 months. I spent the entire summer in that tent. When my mom made me finally come in and sleep in my room again, my closet was normal. The tall man never came back. I eventually stopped thinking about him and grew up. I didn't think of the man again until my wife and I went to a parent-teacher meeting. Wyatt was kept separate from it. The teacher, Mrs. Boyle, thought Wyatt was a great kid, very intelligent and kind, with an expansive imagination. His creativity had typically produced very diverse work, but the past few weeks, things had changed. He'd only been drawing one thing. It was a stick figure of a frightening, distorted-looking man who was very tall. The man's arms and legs were long, too long for the tiny head and body, which were made up of small swirls and spikes. Wyatt had written Mr. Daddy Longlegs on all of the drawings. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt like I was 9 again. Apparently, Wyatt was speaking with Mr. Daddy Longlegs constantly in class. I didn't remember anything else that was said in the meeting. It felt like I went deaf. My wife and I picked Wyatt up from the adjacent classroom after. It was a quiet walk to the car and an even quieter drive. From the back seat, Wyatt finally broke the silence. He asked if Mrs. Boyle brought up the drawings. I said she did bring them up, then asked Wyatt who the man in the drawings was. Wyatt told me, "You know who he is. You met him before." I lied and responded, "I don't remember meeting him." Wyatt leaned forward in his seat, up to my shoulder, and whispered, "He remembers meeting you." And that is the end of the story. I discovered something frightening about my son at a PTA meeting. So, steadily move right along to my next scary story. And this one is called It's been 25 hours since I last ate an apple. Now the doctors are coming. Which I think is kind of a fun title. Alright, let's start. Every night, just before I crawl into bed, I enjoy the treat of a small red apple. I always end my day by eating the succulent fruit. My mother would always insist that I fill my stomach with a healthy snack before sleeping, and what better snack than the good old apple, she used to say. She was right. There was no better treat than the small red sphere of fructose and water. My bedtime ritual may sound strange, but I do believe it gives me a better sleep, and I always awake feeling refreshed and nourished. I have not missed a day of eating an apple for as long as I can remember. Well, that is until a week ago. I felt a yawn build up within my throat, so I let it out with an exaggerated sound. It was getting late, and I was getting tired, so I knew exactly what I needed to do. It was time to devour my apple and go to bed. I got off the couch I'd been sitting on for longer than I would like to admit and headed over to the kitchen. I walked past the large window that overlooks my fairly large backyard and toward the small wooden fruit bowl on my kitchen table. I looked down into and expected to be greeted by a shiny red apple, but instead saw nothing but the bottom of the bowl. It was completely empty. I'd completely forgotten to buy more apples that day, which would have been a better use of my time than being parked in the lounge. This was the first time that this had happened to me. It would be the first time in my post-infant life that I had not eaten a piece of the fruit before going to sleep. I tried not to worry about it too much, but deep down I knew that my sleep would be restless and unfulfilling. I climbed into bed, my stomach rumbling slightly as I positioned myself under the sheets. I closed my eyes and tried to clear my mind, to try to give myself the highest chance of going into a peaceful slumber. With my mind blank, I see nothing but blackness. Sleep was about to be upon me. Sleep was just about to extend its hand and pull me through to the world of unconsciousness when I was startled awake by a slight bumping sound. I jolted upwards in bed and listened for the noise again. Another bump sound echoed through my house. This time I heard it more clearly and realized that it emanated from my backyard. I kept listening, hoping that the noise would stop and I could just forget about it, but it persisted and I heard it for a third time. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know what was causing this disturbance. I got out of my warm bed and hesitantly and anxiously made my way to the kitchen. My plan was to take a peek out of the window that stared directly into the backyard, and then I would be able to see if anything was amiss. I quietly crept into the kitchen area, cautious of what would be causing the sound. I slowly tiptoed over to the large window and took a quick look out into the yard. Outside it seemed mostly normal. The large grass area was still intact, and the long line of trees that ran around the edge of the garden was still and unmoving. The small stone bird bath that stood in the center of the garden was also untouched. There was one thing out of the ordinary in the backyard, though. Standing at the back of the lawn, there was a man. He was staring up towards the window and towards me. His long white lab coat swayed gently in the wind. Around his neck hung a stethoscope, and across his face sat a thick pair of black glasses. The man was clearly two things. He was definitely a doctor, and he was definitely lost. When I first saw him, I was more worried for his personal safety than mine. I was perplexed as to why he was in my yard, but I was concerned that something bad might have happened to him that let him hear. At that moment, I just wanted to help. I left the kitchen and walked over to the back door that leads out to the yard. I opened it and took one lonesome step out into the garden. The doctor followed my every move with his eyes, but otherwise remained motionless. I looked at him for a moment, still trying to comprehend how and why he was standing on my back lawn. I called out to him just to confirm that he was indeed okay. "Hey, excuse me. Are you alright?" I called out in the calmest voice that I could muster. "Do you need any help?" The doctor didn't break eye contact with me, not even to blink, but still remained mute and frozen. I called out once more and again asked him if he needed any aid. Once I'd spoken to him for the second time, I saw a quick flutter of movement from the doctor. His right hand ever so slightly moved closer to the outside of his leg, slightly closer towards his pocket. The small hand movement made me nervous, maybe because it was the first time I had seen him move, or maybe because he moved closer to his concealed pocket, which I couldn't see what it contained. I grew anxious, but still tried to remain calm and deduce what exactly was happening. I opened my mouth, ready in my vocal cords to talk to the doctor again, when I saw his hand quickly reach into his pocket. Before I could react, his hand re-emerged, but it was now holding a large syringe. The needle was long and it glistened slightly in the moonlight. My brain quickly assessed the danger I was now in and wanted to turn and run, but my body wasn't quite that intuitive. My body stayed frozen for just a second too long. I was just about to run away when I heard a rustling sound at my side, and then a white flash of movement. I quickly swiveled my head to see what it was that the corner of my eye had just detected. Coming forth from the trees that run along the edge of my garden, I saw another man come into view. He too wore a long white lab coat and had a stethoscope dangling from his neck. The doctor had wild black hair that sprouted from his head. He also was brandishing something in his hand. It may have been a surgical scalpel, possibly another syringe. I'm not sure entirely, because as soon as I saw him, I took off in the opposite direction. I turned to run back into the house, back to the safety of four walls, but as I spun around and faced the door, I saw another doctor. This one was inside. He was standing just behind the back door, waiting for me to re-enter the house. I rapidly adjusted the direction I was heading and ran along the side of the house and toward the small stone path that leads to the front yard and towards the street. I turned the corner at the edge of the house and began to sprint down the cobbled pathway. I was halfway along it when I saw the fourth doctor step out onto the path from beside the front of the house. In one hand, he held an apple. This doctor, also dressed the same as the others, took a step toward me, tossing the apple into the air as he did. He caught the apple when gravity returned it to him and smiled at me. It was a cold smile, like he was enjoying giving a patient some bad news. I looked behind me for means of escape, but saw that the other three doctors were closing in on me from that direction. I was surrounded and had no other option but to face the doctor holding the apple. I looked back towards him and watched as he inhaled sharply and took in a big sniff. He then started to speak. "I've just tested your blood, and I'm sorry to tell you that it's not good news. I couldn't detect any scent of apple within your veins, and you know the saying," he said emotionlessly. I didn't respond, as I was too frightened and confused to react to what was happening. After pausing for a second and waiting for me to fill the silence, he realized that wasn't going to happen, and so continued to speak. "It's a bit late for this now," he said as he gestured toward the apple with his head. "And one of these a day would have kept us away." As he finished talking, I heard a noise from behind me, and so turned my head around to see what it was. I immediately saw that it was the other 3 doctors advancing toward me. I instinctively moved forward to avoid them getting closer, but in doing so I moved closer to the 4th doctor. I was still looking behind me, and so didn't see that I had walked directly into him until I felt myself bump straight into his chest. I then felt cold hands wrap around my shoulders and a strong grip hold me so that I couldn't move. I spun my head back around and faced the doctor that had now kept me captured. I looked directly into his cold blue eyes and begged him to let me go. "Please," I stammered. "I don't understand what's happening." All 4 doctors began to laugh at the same time, and I felt the presence of the other 3 directly behind me. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to fight. I had to fight it. It was the only option left. I swiftly swiped my hand at the doctor who was holding me. My fingers scratched against his pale cheek, and I saw 4 deep gouges in his skin appear. Normally the scratches would fill with red blood, but his did not. The skin was wounded, but no liquid emerged from beneath his flesh. He looked down at me, no emotion on his face apart from maybe slight disappointment. I then felt something sharp enter my neck. Everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious for, but I awoke sometime later and discovered myself in my bed. My initial thought was that it had all been a dream, but then I felt something wrapped around my neck. I looked down and saw that the stethoscope that was placed resting on my nape. I then noticed the white lab coat that I was wearing. It was identical to the coats that my attackers were also wearing. I panicked as I was thoroughly confused as to what I was seeing. Had they just played a cruel and dangerous prank on me? Had they scared me and then dressed me up as a doctor too? No. There had to be more to it than that. And there was. Those events all took place a week ago, and since then I haven't been able to remove my lab coat and stethoscope. I mean, I physically would be able to take them off, but I don't want to. I can also smell other people. Not their perfume or deodorant, but their blood. More often than not, though, it's tainted with the repulsive smell of apple. When I smell someone's blood who is pure, not ruined by that stench, it makes me hungry. Maybe I crave it because I'm missing my own. I cut myself shaving the day after I was attacked, and to my surprise, no blood seeped out of the wound. I then decided to prick my fingers with a sewing pin, and again there was no blood. I think the doctors drank my clean blood, and it somehow transformed me into one of them. I have no other explanation as to what has happened to me, but I have a feeling that they will return to me. I think they will come back, and then we can go and hunt. I found that one kind of funny, obviously. I just thought it was, I think that was an interesting one. Alright. This next story is called "My Friend Works for the City's CCTV Archives and Has Seen Some Disturbing Things." I hadn't seen Mike in a few months. He'd been buried in work, and our usual weekday nights out had about disappeared. Then he called me on a Thursday and invited me over for drinks. I jumped at the invite, but took note of how depressed he sounded on the phone. By the time I got there, Mike had already started drinking and was slurring his words. A dark cloud seemed to hover over him, which got worse as we drank. I finally asked, "What's been going on with him?" Mike turned darker, afraid. He said it had to do with work. I never really knew what Mike did for a living. I did know he worked for the city in the tech department and was involved with the CCTV surveillance network, but I never knew what his day-to-day operations were, which he began to describe in detail. Mike explained there were thousands of cameras scattered throughout the downtown core, outlying neighborhoods, and well into the suburbs of our 1 million plus city. His responsibility was to categorize and archive all the incoming footage. Most of the footage went into very general classifications and were saved in hard drive forms and identified with the lengthy combination of numbers and letters for categorical archiving. They were truly meant to be forgotten about. It was an expensive task, but Mike designed and built an AI screening program that detected common patterns in footage, then sectioned out anomalous behavior for review. The vast majority wasn't noteworthy, something like 99.99%. Then there was the 0.01%. The car accidents, assaults, swarmings, abductions, murders, those went into a special archive for use in criminal investigation. And then there was the 0.0001%. They were held in a classified archive and contained footage capturing events that were, for all accounts, were unexplainable. This was called the Tartarus Archive. I looked up the word Tartarus after and discovered it was one of the darkest, deepest prisons from Greek mythology. It was said that if you dropped an anvil from heaven, it would take 7 days for it to reach the earth. It would take another 7 days for the anvil to reach Tartarus. It was the place you sent titans when there was nowhere else that could contain them. When Sisyphus was condemned to an eternity of futility and frustration with a large boulder in a mountain slope, that punishment was carried out in Tartarus. As it turned out, the name was quite fitting to the archive's growing contents. Some footage could be simplified to strange optical anomalies in the camera and coincidences of light or crackheads on a bender through the subway system. Other footage, though, defied logic. The others are what captured Mike's mind that evening. He'd been breaking protocol and bringing hard drives home at night. In fact, he'd been splicing the footage together, capturing and compiling repeat aberrations and editing them into linear sequences. Mike wanted to show me some. It wasn't in a bragging or showing off kind of way. It felt more like the sharing of a heavy burden kind of way. I asked if showing me would get him in trouble, but he waved the idea away. I said, yeah, obviously, I want to see what's going on in my city. Mike led me into his workroom, where he had monitors and towers and piles of externals set up. We sat down and skimmed through some drives nervously. Then he landed on one. Mike told me this anomaly was codenamed Lincoln Spectre. He pressed play. On the largest screen, black and white footage started up, showing Lincoln Avenue, one of our less attractive downtown streets, at 3 a.m. The camera angle showed the length of Lincoln Ave as it led into the downtown core. The street appeared empty and quiet. From the side road, a woman emerged, walking toward the camera. As she approached the intersection, she turned over her shoulder and appeared to scream. The woman took off, sprinting past the camera, which cut to a new, wider angle from another camera across the street. We watched the woman running frantically, seemingly being chased. But she was the only one on the screen. There was no one else anywhere around her. The woman kept screaming as she ran, and cameras kept following, cutting between different CCTV angles. We watched as the woman was chased into the middle of an empty intersection. She fell, then cowered as if something massive was standing over her. The woman's neck stiffened, and she began to levitate off the ground. Her body looked like a rag doll. Something lifted her by the throat until she was floating 12 feet above the road in the middle of the intersection. Then the woman's head snapped to the left, and her body fell back to the ground. Then the video ended and went black. I sat, shocked. Mike saw my expression and said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." I asked if that was real, if what I saw was unaltered, was raw footage. Mike said all he'd done was put the clips together. None of the content had been touched. He told me he found out the incident ended up being described as a hit and run, and the case was left figuratively open for more evidence to amass, which it never would. The department kept the footage hidden, claiming it was a camera malfunction. No one outside of Mike and his boss had seen the video of how the poor woman actually died. I started to understand the air of somberness Mike was carrying around. Mike started the next video. This one was codenamed Black Crab and was much longer than the previous one. It started in the subway systems at the underground Walkley station shortly after closing up for the night. Walkley was the last stop on the route, and the exterior was sheltered by a new housing development on one side and untouched forest and swampland on the other. The camera was pointed down along the subway platform on the east side and showed its entire length with benches and garbage cans populating it. At the far end, the tunnel was filled with darkness. The lights on the platform shut off, and the station went dark. The camera switched to night vision, and everything became visible again. My eyes trained on the platform, waiting for something to happen. Finally, there was movement. It was coming from the tunnel. It was difficult to identify what exactly it was at first, as its movements were strange and the footage was grainy. But it got closer to the camera and I got a better look. It resembled a human, a man, but he was walking on his hands and feet, upside down, with his back arched and his stomach pointed to the ceiling. He had long, dark hair that dragged along the ground, and he wore tattered layers of old jackets and torn pants. He moved like a crab, jerkily yet quickly and easily as he made his way to the staircase. The footage cut to a new camera in the dark hallway leading to the stairs out of the station. I watched the crab walker claw up 2 steps at a time and then crawl over the turnstiles and toward the exit. The footage cut again, now showing the exterior of the station entrance. The crab walker squeezed and twisted and maneuvered his body through the locked and closed entrance gate. It looked impossible to accomplish, but he did it. Once outside, the crab walker eyed his surroundings before skittering off into the woods and disappearing. The footage cut to an hour later and revealed the crab walker reappearing from the woods. He was dragging a small animal by the tail in his teeth. The animal looked like a cat. The crab walker squeezed back through the gate, crawled to the station, and disappeared into the subway tunnel. Again, Mike saw my expression and told me there was more. He showed me the length of the video, which was over an hour long. Mike had compiled over 20 sequences of the crab walker creeping out of the subway station and into the woods. Mike skimmed through the video towards the end, and we watched the crab walker come out of the sewer in a downtown alleyway. It crawled over to a pile of garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Then it jumped into them, and some kind of vicious frenzy ensued. There was someone else in the pile of garbage. Hands and feet thrashed about as they were struggling for their life. Then the movement stopped and the hands and feet went still. The crab walker's body moved jerkily about, but I couldn't see what was happening because of the darkness and all the garbage bags and boxes obscuring the camera's view. Mike leaned over to me and whispered that the crab walker was eating a homeless man. This caused a criminal investigation, as the dead body was found mutilated and festering in the open alleyway. Mike followed up on the inquiry. What he discovered was the crab walker was who authorities believed to be a man named David Fletcher. Decades ago, David had been a prominent lawyer with the family. One Christmas, there was a house fire, and his wife and kids were killed in the blaze. It was David's fault. He lost everything, including his mind. Everyone has a breaking point, whether they know it or not. A place where they bend too far and then snap. David found his. Family and friends described his descent as nightmarish. David lived on the streets, became addicted to drugs, and tumbled into mental illness. The last anyone knew of him was from 10 years ago. He'd thrown himself in front of a subway at the Walkley station, and no one heard from or saw him again. It appeared that somehow David had survived the subway hit. His back had broken and healed strangely, causing him to move the way he did. He'd adapted to the new posture and lived in the darkness of the subway tunnels, finding sustenance from drain water and the wild animals he caught. That was what Mike found out, at least. But then he said, that was just the answer the investigators gave in Discovery. Who knows where the truth lay? Mike said there was always an answer for the videos he saw. Whether the answers were true or not, no one knew. But the ones that had to become public all needed explanations, however absurd. Either way, David was never found and didn't reappear on the subway footage. Mike plugged a new hard drive in. He poured a fresh drink and told me this is the one that was troubling him. The file was codenamed Cloud Mirror. I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but before I could object, Mike pressed play. All the monitors lit up with footage from different intersections downtown on the exact date and time as each other. There were 5 in total. The streets on each screen were empty and quiet, no cars or people. Suddenly, at the exact same time, in the center of the intersections, a small glow pulsed into existence. It was some kind of orb, roughly the size of a bowling ball. Streetlights around it pulsed with energy waves as the orb grew larger. It grew to the size of a beach ball. Then it flashed out. The streetlights went back to normal and the intersection was as lifeless as it was before. I asked Mike what they were. He told me he had gigs of footage of the orbs and had watched them repeatedly. He didn't know what they were at first. Then they started to change. I clicked onto the next video. Again, the 5 monitors all lit up with the exact same intersections and time of night, but several weeks later. The streetlights glowed and pulsed, and an orb manifested into existence again. It grew to its beach ball size, then altered its surface and glow. Something gas-like replaced it, growing outward into a couch-sized cloud of dark gray. One of the cameras was closer, so I got to see the small clouds in detail. It looked like a volcanic eruption wrapping around itself. There were large, constantly morphing blobs that curled outward from a glowing center, revealing a mandelbulb fractal as a gaseous-based organism. It was fascinating to see them floating in the middle of the street, so alien to our roads and stoplights and street lamps. Then they began to move, gliding down empty roads. The cameras cut to different angles, following the clouds on some unknown path, zigging and zagging onto new streets and through alleyways. Then they'd stop. The clouds hovered in the center of their intersection. They'd lower to ground level, standing straight up like a large coffin, holding rigid to the shape. Their exteriors continued to shift and mold together like magnets made of smoke. Something on one of the monitors caught my eye. Down the street, people appeared. They'd seen the cloud and were walking towards it. The group looked drunk and fascinated by the floating entity, so much so they were approaching it. As they did, the cloud became brighter. The street lamps around it pulsed. The group were in some kind of trance, staring into the morphing blob. One of the group, a guy, stared into it like a zombie, then walked right into the cloud and disappeared. None of the group tried to stop him. Instead, another one followed him in, and another, and another. All 5 members of the group disappeared in the cloud. Then they reappeared, one at a time, the guy first, then in the order they went in. Only they weren't stumbling and boisterous and drunk. Now they were walking upright, using minimal movements. They formed in a perfect 5-person circle for several seconds over quick words, then turned, and all went in separate directions. Their strides, arm swings, and speed all matched. Another monitor showed a similar situation with a large group of people lost in reverie as they marched one after another into the cloud. Each monitor showed the same thing now. People entering the clouds and coming back out. Different. Mike stopped the video. I asked him if he'd shown this to anyone else. He said he hasn't. Not even to his boss, which was a problem because he had a meeting with his boss in the morning to discuss the missing footage. I asked why he didn't show the footage to his boss. This footage seemed more than serious. People were being replaced by something. Mike sighed and put a new video on. The main monitor lit up and showed a new downtown street. The date was from earlier this week. One of the clouds was floating in the intersection. A middle-aged couple were walking nearby, the husband with a slight limp in his right leg. The couple saw the cloud and were sucked in by its aura. They approached it, eyes wide, mouths open. Both the husband and wife entered the cloud and disappeared. After a moment, they reappeared. The husband's limp was gone. Mike turned to me and said, "That was my boss and his wife." I think it's like a invasion of the body snatchers kind of thing almost, right? Like, it was like an alien checking out Earth and then snatching up people and replacing them. I don't know. I just thought that was pretty cool. But now we're gonna move along to our last story for this spooky Saturday scary story reading. It's called If They Call Your Name, Never Answer. My Aunt Bonnie and cousin Jedediah lived far out in the country. The first time I'd ever stayed overnight was a long time coming. For some reason, despite Jed and my closeness, there was always a tug and pull between our families. For years I wanted to sleep over and they denied it. We were adolescents now, and after what happened, I can see why they wanted us to mature a bit. It was early winter. We played baseball and shot BB guns in the yard all day, ate dinner, and asked to go outside just a little longer. Bonnie demanded we be in before dark. An understandable demand from a protective parent. But then Jed said something strange. "Stay with me. Don't go near the woods." "Why?" I asked. "Wolves," his dad interrupted. Good enough for me. Something about my uncle's voice, though, when he said wolves, sounded more like an excuse than a real reason. I'd never seen a wolf in Pennsylvania. We snuck to the tree line and just threw rocks as far as we could, listening for them to splash in the creek. If it did, that meant one of us had a hell of a throw. We both wanted to become MLB pitchers. We adhered to the rules, went inside at dusk, and slept through the night, though I did wake up at one point to hear what sounded like laughter outside. The noise went in and out, and I never gave it a second thought. Probably neighbors. I didn't think of it again until we left and drove down the road leading away from the house. I asked my grandma where the neighbor's house was. They own 200 acres on all sides. There aren't neighbors for at least a mile in every direction. I felt momentarily uneasy, but it passed. My Aunt Bonnie was much more lenient the next visit, which was the following weekend. Just be in before dark. We know. Without question, she emphatically stated. We had 2 hours until dark, when suddenly a warm front rolled in, and an ever-thickening fog came in. "You boys stay in the yard," Uncle Rick shouted authoritatively. You don't question Uncle Rick, a man who regularly handled venomous rattlesnakes with his bare hands. We were playing baseball, and as the formless mall continued to drift across the state, the sound of blaring warning sirens wailed from afar, incrementally increasing in decibel level up and down in an eerie, howling sort of tone. "It's the no-drive siren," Jed explained. "Our fogs can be dangerous out here." We still could see within reasonable distances around us. Aunt Bonnie called for us to come in when Jed asked for one last pitch. I threw the ball, and he slugged it far over my head and into the woods. I hadn't thought about the no-woods rule since last time. I guess they assumed we'd comply. We intended to, but my uncalculated instinctual reaction was to follow the ball, and inadvertently I sprinted beyond the tree line and into the woods, probably 50 yards in retrospect. The last thing I heard Jed cry out was "no." Night was falling, and I'd run so far into the woods I couldn't see which direction was which. As the fog grew dense and uniform, my line of sight dwindled to 10 or 15 feet on all sides. "Greg!" Jedediah shouted, but I was busy looking for my new ball, which I swore hit the dry, crunching leaves not too far from me. When I realized I'd never find it, a bothersome reality set in, amidst the cacophonous siren and screams for my name. "Greg!" Jed shouted once again, clearly emanating from my 6. But as I paced in his direction, once again, my name was shouted from the opposite direction, deeper into the woods. The only thing which caused a chill to run through my blood was that the voice coming from the brush sounded like a little girl. Just as the trees began to crack and settle into the ever-shifting winds, I got a dreadful feeling. "Hello?" I cried out. Only the sound of cackling, high up in the trees and far away. "Hello?" I screamed, my tone infused with nervous distress. And then a rustling, like leaves dragged upon by something coming at me from just ahead, getting closer and closer. And then, spoken delicately like a young child, I heard, "Greg?" A gentle question, followed by surreal and horrifying vision. 2 bare feet, attached to bare legs, hovering just above the ground, toes dragging against the forest floor. Then the sudden thumping of footsteps sprinting at me, attached to a bright light. I was instantly pulled with inhuman strength by a tight grip. It was Uncle Rick. "You go back home," he angrily shouted over my head. I was swept away, Uncle Rick urging me to run and not let go of his hand. We broke through the trees and barreled forward through the porch door, and then into the house in a blur. He locked the door frantically. I didn't even know what I saw. "You don't know what's in those woods," he yelled as he shakily fastened the lock and hatch. "Turn off the lights." This was the reason, I assumed, for the no woods, no night rule. I wasn't even sure what I really saw. Nobody got angry. I didn't even get yelled at. Just told to go to our room and get to bed. Aunt Bonnie had an expression not of disappointment but of concern. Jedediah looked frightened. We didn't say anything to each other. He went to bed and I got in my sleeping bag on Jed's floor. I couldn't fall asleep, only ponder what it was I'd actually seen in those woods. It got quiet for a while, but then I heard it. Same thing from last time. Laughter outside, only it sounded like it was closer, in the yard. It sounded like children were chasing each other in circles around the house. It got silent eventually. It would be a while before I got drowsy, maybe an hour. And that's when I heard a sound at Jed's window. Delicate scratches, like fingernails. Jed spoke out quietly. Don't pay attention to it. It'll go away. I'm not sure what was more unsettling. The fact that Jed had been lying awake in scared silence for over an hour, or the fact that the tapping on the window sounded like a person trying to get our attention. Our room was on the second floor. The next day, on the way home, I began to tell my grandma what had happened, until she stopped me. We drove on in uncomfortable silence as I felt scolded for several miles, and then I finally asked, "What was it?" "Last night." She took a puff of her cigarette and exhaled, blowing it out of the cracked window. "There are things around those woods that we don't understand. The house belongs to your family, but the forest will always belong to them. If they call your name, never answer." The end. So what do you think it was? What do you think was calling Greg's name out in the woods? I like that the author leaves that to our interpretation. In fact, a few of them were sort of open to your own interpretation of what was the spooky thing that was actually happening. So, I hope you liked this year's spooky stories, and I hope that they weren't too scary for you, and that you're still able to close your eyes and go to sleep tonight. Maybe you've even already fallen asleep. That would be amazing. If you like this sort of thing, I have, I think, 2 other scary story videos from the past 2 years. Yeah. So I have quite a long list of fun, short, scary stories that I've gotten off Reddit that you can listen to me tell you. And you can find them all in my spooky ASMR playlist. You can either find that if you go on my channel and go to playlists, or I also have a link to that playlist in this description. So, hope you enjoyed it. I know that this is something that gets highly requested that I do every year, and it can be hard to find stories that are like the right level of spooky. You know, you want them to be creepy, but not like gross, gory. Yeah, alright. Anyway, thank you for listening to another year of spooky, scary skeletons. And another Spooky Saturday video for this year. I'll have another Spooky Saturday video for you next week. And then my anniversary special. So stay tuned. Look forward to that. And I'm wishing you lots of love tonight. Protection against the spooky stuff. Make sure that you tuck yourself in tight, and then that way no monsters can get you. You'll be fine. Alright, so sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs or the monsters bite. And see you in another Spooky Saturday video. See you in another non-spooky video. I'll talk to you later. Goodbye and good night, everyone.